in the context of a voting booth, these attitudes may not reflect what they say publicly. And this poses a large issue for researchers because a lot of our attitudes research is based off of this self-reported attitude. And this self-reported data is suggesting that attitudes towards stigmatized groups is becoming more and more positive. But if we're asking people to report in this self-reported public way, do these attitudes maybe misrepresent what's actually happening? So we investigate this question in two studies. The first study investigates tolerance towards stigmatized groups, such as Muslims, African Americans, and women. And the second study investigates tolerance for deplorable acts, such as racism, homophobia, and rape. Although these seem like two different studies, we view them as two studies reflecting two sides of the same coin. In both studies, we hypothesize that when people are asked to report their attitudes publicly or directly, they may report being really tolerant or really intolerant. But when asked to report their attitudes privately, we may actually find less tolerance for stigmatized groups and more tolerance for deplorable acts. Now, to investigate this question, we use the context of voting. And lots of attitudes towards stigmatized groups is assessed by these willingness to vote polls, where people are asked, if your party nominated someone who's qualified, who happened to be from this stigmatized category, would you be willing to vote for this individual? So for example, if your party nominated someone who is a woman, would you be okay voting for this individual? And these willingness to vote polls tend to paint a similar picture, just that people are becoming more and more tolerant of these stigmatized groups. However, we're arguing that this question itself may actually incite some social desirability concerns, such that people may not be willing to tell me whether or not they'd be able to vote for a woman because they're afraid that their response would lead them to a peer prejudice. And therefore, we may not be getting a fully accurate picture of tolerance for diversity. So to circumvent this issue, we use an indirect measure in conjunction with a direct measure. And specifically, we use the unmatched count approach. This employs three conditions, two of which are the indirect measure. The third is the direct measure. Across all conditions, we ask the same question. So if my party had nominated someone who is generally well qualified, who happened to be blank, I would vote for that person. In the first part of the indirect condition, we fill that blank with just innocuous items. So who happened to be from a rich family or who happened to be a coffee drinker. And participants are just asked to tell us how many of these people they would vote for, not which ones. So for example, if I'm the participant, maybe I'm willing to vote for a coffee drinker, but no one else, and my response would just be one. But you, as a researcher, would have no idea if my response of one was reflecting me being able to vote for a rich person versus a coffee drinker. Now we take this condition and the base rates of that and we compare it to a sensitive condition where they see the same exact filler items, but now one sensitive item. And as the participant, I go through the same exact task and I just tally up who I vote for. So maybe I'm still only willing to vote for a coffee drinker and my response is still one. Now, the mean difference between these two conditions, or the lack thereof, can be attributed to that sensitive item. And we could compare the mean difference of these two conditions to when we just asked the participant directly, would you be willing to vote for a woman, yes or no? The difference between the direct and the indirect, we can attribute to social desirability. And this is what I'm calling reporting your attitudes publicly versus privately. We collected a large, nationally representative sample, randomly assigned to those three conditions of that unmatched count approach, and we asked about these stigmatized groups. So whether people would be willing to vote for an atheist, a black person, a Catholic, a gay person, a Muslim, or a woman. And across all of these groups, we hypothesized that people would say, yes, I would be supportive of this candidate when asked directly, but we would see much lower levels of support when asked indirectly. So I'm going to take some time and step through this graph. It's also a little bit small. So we have the candidate, atheist, black, Catholic, gay, Muslim, and woman. Higher numbers here reflect more willingness to vote, more tolerance. We analyze these data using Bayesian hierarchical modeling. I'm a Bayes pragmatist, not expert, meaning Bayes was just the simplest way to analyze these data. What you'll see here are means. The means are going to be triangles when they're asked directly, the self-reported. And circles when asked indirectly. The error bars are HPDIs, which is essentially just like the 97 most credible, most plausible estimate for that mean. And the Cliff Notes version, because I always need the Cliff Notes version, we're expecting the triangles to be higher than the circles. That would suggest that people are reporting more tolerance when asked directly versus indirectly. And consistent with our hypothesis across all target attitudes, we do find a significant difference that people say, yes, I'd be willing to vote for this person when asked directly. That's significantly higher than when asked indirectly. And the largest gap here is when they're asked about voting for a candidate who happens to be black or a woman. Yeah, that hurts.
Yeah, a little bit.
We also did some subgroup analyses. I'm only going to show you 2 of them because I think they're interesting and theoretically important. The first is we broke our participants down by age. It's going to be graphed here by a median split, but we didn't analyze our data that way. Don't worry, it's just for ease. On the left-hand side, these are older individuals. On the right-hand side, these are younger individuals. And what we find here is the gap between the direct and indirect measure is much larger for older individuals than it is for younger individuals. And overall, older individuals are simply less willing to vote for these stigmatized candidates than are younger individuals. We again split our data by education. On the left-hand side, these are individuals who have a max of a high school education. On the right-hand side, these are individuals who have more than a high school education. And again, we see a larger gap here between the self-reported and the indirect for more educated individuals than less educated individuals. Interesting, what this gap is telling us is that more educated people are simply better at hiding their public prejudice. That one also hurts. Overall, our data suggests that Americans tend to over-report support for these stigmatized candidates, and this direct measure may particularly overestimate amongst the elderly and educated individuals. Next, we decided to investigate the flip side of the coin, which is tolerance or intolerance for deplorable acts. These acts are chosen because these are acts that elected officials have committed. Yet, they are acts that everybody in this room deems socially unacceptable. So again, we use that same approach, 3,000 participants. These are different participants this time. Nationally represented, randomly assigned to condition, and now they're asked, would they vote for a person who happened to be homophobic, a pedophile, a racist, a rapist, and a sexist? Again, I'm going to take a little bit of time and step through this graph. We've got homophobic, pedophile, racist, rapist, sexist. Higher numbers still represent tolerance, so support for voting for this candidate. So overall, we just expect the numbers to be lower. Now we sort of are expecting, an opposite pattern. So we expect when you ask people directly, would you vote for someone who is homophobic, that triangle is going to be lower than when we ask for an indirect, suggesting that there's more intolerance when asked directly versus indirectly. Now, to be clear, our results are not as strong as study 1. Overall, our Bayes factors are just much lower. But we do find evidence across all of these candidates that people say they would not vote for them when asked directly, but when asked indirectly, we've got higher levels. But we do have the largest gaps for when our candidate is a pedophile, a rapist, and a sexist, the sexist being on orders that we saw in study 1. So it's a pretty huge Bayes factor. And across all of these large ones, there's the same pattern that people say when asked directly, no, I would never vote for this person. But when asked indirectly, we were seeing greater levels of tolerance. We again broke this down by our demographic characteristics, age, and education. So left-hand side is older individuals, right-hand side is younger individuals. We see a larger gap for older individuals between the direct and indirect measure, suggesting that older individuals are more likely to vote for this candidate when asked indirectly than directly. In addition, we see a similar pattern with education. So this is max of a high school education. This is more than high school education. The gaps are larger for more educated individuals. Again, this gap is telling us that more educated individuals are simply better at hiding publicly their intolerance or tolerance for these deplorable candidates. So again, we think these two studies suggest evidence for this acting hypothesis, that in study 1, people are saying they're tolerant of these stigmatized groups, and in study 2, they're saying that they're intolerant of these deplorable acts. And this intolerance, it may be particularly driven, or particularly for those who are elderly and educated. Now, to be clear, we have limitations. First and foremost, these data cannot speak to any specific candidates or any specific contests. And the reason is because we tell the participant to imagine that this candidate comes from their own party. Presumably, that candidate has a party platform with whatever they're imagining in their head, and that's the reason why I can't directly speak to contests. In addition, our data lack granularity to investigate how local issues may influence people's response. And as you hear about later from Ines, local issues such as taking down Confederate monuments can have a major effect on people's attitudes. And unfortunately, we just don't have the granularity to investigate that question. But I think it would be a really important one to follow up on. Finally, these data are point-in-time estimates. So it's really just measuring attitudes at that point in time, which is about a year ago at this point. And I think it would be particularly important to investigate trends over time, particularly given the age findings. So if younger individuals tend to be overall more tolerant, we may see the difference between public and private attitudes diminishing and becoming more positive over time. Despite these limitations, I think we have evidence for this acting hypothesis. And sadly, what our data is finding is that people are claiming to be more tolerant of stigmatized individuals and more intolerant of deplorable acts than what might be happening behind closed doors. I want to thank my collaborators, Gervais, Maxine, and Sarah, and thank you, SPSSI, for having us. And thank you, and I'd be happy to answer maybe a question.